This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Guido, welcome to the Human Action Podcast.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Bob.
Well, as we were talking about before we started rolling, I see you're nice and bundled up there, ready for a warm intellectual discussion here.
Yeah, I'll take my jacket out then, if we really get going.
So the topic is, I was scrolling through social media and I saw this announcement that Grove City College had digitized and placed online the archives from Ludwig von Mises, the post-war years. And I inquired and said, hey, who can I interview to talk about this? And they said, Guido Hülsmann. And I said, yes, I'm familiar with that man. So that's why you're here. So what can you tell us about these documents that are now online?
Well, the documents are Mises' correspondence and the papers that he kept in his apartment coming to the U.S. after 1940 and everything that he had accumulated as from then. So he brought just a few things, as you can imagine, from Europe. He was on his flight. He didn't have a moving company working for him. So he couldn't bring any furniture, couldn't bring any documents. He just probably kept the most important things, life records and so on, and came empty-handed to the US. And everything else was, what he had in Geneva was then eventually moved to the US. So this is also part of the Grove City archive. And everything that had been in his Vienna apartment up to 1938, which was the year when the National Socialists moved into Austria and annexed Austria to Germany, that had been captured by the Gestapo and eventually recovered by the Red Army at the end of the war. So they brought it to Moscow. And it was in Moscow that I consulted these documents. And a few years back, they had been returned to Austria. So currently, they're in the State Archive in Vienna, Staatsarchiv. The box, it's about the same volume that you would find in Grove City, maybe a bit less, but roughly it's the same volume. So in Grove City, we find everything that had been in his apartment in Geneva and then accumulated during his years in the US. After his death, Margaret von Mises was looking for sources of revenue, of money. So she decided to sell both his library and the documents to people who might be interested in this. And I think Professor Hans Sennholz arranged for the sale. And so we were just talking before, speculating. I don't remember the details. I knew them once, but I forgot. This is more than 20 years ago that I did the research. It might be that everything at first went to Hillsdale, and then later on the documents were given to Grove City. It's not given, purchased by Grove City College. And the library, the Mises library, is still at Hillsdale College in a special room. It's a large room, and we have this wonderful volumes, probably with some of Mises linings of the text in the different volumes. So this is still in Hillsdale. And we are talking here about the documents which are presently in Grove City, where I had first seen them at the end of the 90s. And then to facilitate my research, they had sent us a full set of copies in the early 2000s to the Mises Institute. So there's another copy of the Hillsdale archive at the Mises Institute. And now they've digitalized it, which is a great service to all people who are interested in Ludwig von Mises and wish to carry on more biographical research and research about the origins of Austrian economics and the Austrian movement after World War II. Okay,
great. And I definitely want to come back to and go through some of the key things that are in there that people might find if they go perusing. But you touched on something, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to ambush you with this, but it just popped into my head that recently on social media, I can't remember the exact way that they put it, but somebody, it's like some leftist progressive was criticizing the popular technique by which fans of Mises say, and he fled from the Nazis. And they said, no, Mises was quite a reactionary. He wrote things in favor of fascism. The Nazis were quite happy with him, maybe because he was Jewish, they didn't like him. And they said something too, like, he didn't flee. He was like, he went abroad because he had a good job opportunity or something. He left his wife. Anyway, so can you just speak a bit to that? Like, are we romanticizing it when we say Mises fled from the Nazis? Was it just that, he had a better opportunity, or did he genuinely fear that, he was not, Mises and Adolf were not good buddies?
I mean, he was really literally fleeing. And certainly if you look at his documents from those days, there were a few days that he spent on the road going with a bus from Geneva through southern France to the French-Spanish border. I mean, definitely Mises and his wife, they were really afraid. I mean, this was a great time of excitement. It was not, just we are hopping onto a new job opportunity. They were fearing for their lives. And the same thing held true for all other people who were ideologically opposed to the National Socialists. They had to fear for their life. They certainly had to fear for imprisonment. In the case of Mises, because he was Jewish, he must have feared for his life. Clearly, he was in for Auschwitz or similar treatment.
It wasn't merely his ethnicity that his writings were actively opposed to the entire premise of National Socialism.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think he was actually stopped at some place when cruising with his car in Switzerland before the war. He was actually stopped by some National Socialists. And they were trying to ask a question and so on. He escaped. I forgot the exact circumstances, but clearly he was very apprehensive about this. And the National Socialists were going. They were famous for going opponents, left-wing opponents, right-wing opponents. The right-wing people were not less threatened than the others. And there were lots of Jewish right-wing people who ended up in the concentration camps. And they were taking people massively away from the countries in which they controlled the ground, such as France. They were taking them massively away and sending them to concentration camps. That's not fantasy or something. It's just a fact. And Mises, so he took the car. They were very afraid. They were sitting in the bus with other refugees. They were late. For reasons that I do not know, he had waited a very long time to arrange for his exit from Switzerland. Probably he had not expected the French army to lose so rapidly. He had expected much more resistance. And it was a surprise actually for everyone how easily the Germans conquered France, not the least to the French themselves. And so by the end of May, early June 1940, he had to act. So that's when he made his preparations. There were no more flights to be had. A couple of his other colleagues had left by plane, but there were no more flights going out because by then Switzerland was surrounded by the National Socialists in the north and the Italian fascists in the south. So there were no more private planes leaving. So he had to go by bus, and he had arranged for paperwork, but then his visa had expired by the time they arrived at the border because the bus somehow became late and so on. So they had to apply for an extension at the Portuguese embassy in Toulouse. So Mises left Margit at the border with the other refugees, and he took all the passports because he had good connections to government circles in Lisbon. He went to the embassy in Toulouse, to the consulate in Toulouse, and got the papers thanks to his contacts. So if he hadn't had a direct line to the office of the prime minister through Jewish contacts and people from the International Chamber of Commerce on the ground in Lisbon, they might have got stuck and they might have been kidnapped.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then he eventually comes to New York and works at NYU?
Yeah, he spent about a week in Lisbon, and had been recently a nice article published by some Portuguese gentleman or scholar narrating these events from the archival material that he recovered in Geneva and also in Lisbon. So Mises met quite a few political and business leaders in Lisbon during that week, and then he arrived in New York another week later after the passage on the ship.
Okay, great. So
now,
again,
but again, as far as his opposition, I mean, he was under the hood with the National Socialists. That's of course complete fantasy. I mean, the reason why this sometimes pop up is because in his book with the title Liberalism, a 1927 publication, 1927, right, not 1940. Mises had said, speaking of fascism, because at the time the National Socialist movement in Germany had not been nearly as important as the fascists in Italy. So he was speaking of the fascists and said, there can be no doubt that fascism has preserved Italy, or has saved Italy for the moment from the sort of bloodshed that had happened in Soviet Russia. Let's not forget, I mean, so the Reds, they come to power, they kill massively all of their opponents. I mean, that's not a special or monopoly of the National Socialists, right? That they lock up all their people and they kill opponents. The first guys who do this really massively in that period, I mean, there are other countries where similar things had happened before, but in that period was Soviet Russia. So the Reds come to power and they massively kill hundreds of thousands of priests. They kill political opponents, they kill everybody, right? Or send them in the gulag camps if it's necessary. But the first preferred method is to kill, because then the problem is solved, no more costs involved, right? So that was the reality. And in that context, Mises writes, a few years later, when the facts had been known, would generally acknowledge and say, well, fascism has saved Italy, has spared Italy the same fate. And this is a civilizational achievement which will not be forgotten. And then he added right away after this, but this will not guarantee the success of fascism in any way, because the problem of fascism is that they only have violence to offer. Violence can be a suitable means to confront brutal violence on the other side, okay, but it's not a constructive force. So you need to have something else. You need to have ideas, you need to have a civilizational project, which was not the case really of fascism, at least as Mises saw it. So far from praising fascism, he said, yes, okay, there was some good side of fascism. Such as he might have found nice words to say about some communists in Central Europe. And let's not forget also that he helped many communist colleagues, right, to emigrate to the US and to Britain, right? Emil Lederer and various others were communist intellectuals, and Mises helped them. Right, so I mean, the idea that he was someone under the hood with the fascists is completely ludicrous. I don't know why this pops up. It must be despair, because if people read Mises' text, it's so obvious there was anything but a National Socialist or fascist or whatever right-wing thug, and actually has very appealing and wonderful ideas like penetrating economic analysis. So probably the only way to get this out of the room is just to badmouth him and to call him names and whatever.
Right. And also, too, just the irony that you're saying, even that one passage that people like to strip out, and you say often they present it without the context, is coming from his book celebrating liberalism. Like, that's kind of a weird place for you to explain to everyone how great fascism is in your book explaining the virtues of liberalism.
Yeah, but of course, for some of the socialists or communists at the time and today as well, liberalism is just another form of fascism. Right? Free market economics is just the economic manifestation of fascism, according to them. So it's the confusion between free markets and cronyism and so on. I mean, okay, if there's a complete refusal to engage in thought and to make distinctions, and you just say everything that is not socialist must be fascism. So this was the Stalinist strategy, right? Everything that's not for us is against us. So it's anti, and we are anti-fascists. So, right.
Very good.
Very cheap.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you for clarifying and setting the record straight. Okay. So then, yeah, for people who are hearing this and they're interested, and, can you maybe give some guidance as to what sort of tidbits are in this online archive now that they can go peruse?
Well, so we have here the archive material is ordered in different files, right? So you have, for example, for each letter, you have an A file, a B file, and C file, and these files of just by general letter, they contain a bit of the miscellaneous correspondence. So authors with whom people with whom he would just have one or two letters or so, and it's not particularly important. Then you have files specifically dedicated to one person. For example, they are the Maklub files, right? With Fritz Maklub, who had been his doctoral student in Vienna and then became a professor in the US, first at the University of Buffalo and then at Princeton. And so with Maklub, he had an extensive correspondence both before the war and after the war. And you would find them in the Maklub files, right? And some of this material is interesting. For example, you would find in the Maklub files, you find correspondence on capital theory and especially on the concept of the period of production. And so Maklub had in 1934, he had sent a questionnaire to all Austrian economists working in the field of capital theory, raising questions about the concept of the period of production and so on. He got responses for all of them. And then there was some follow-up correspondence with Mises on these responses and so on, right? Another thing in what I found interesting was a correspondence.
Can I ask you, Guido, was that stuff like, was there anything new in there? Like for people who have read like the books and articles that are in the published literature, were there, because I actually have a PhD student who's working on this stuff and I'm wondering like, do I need to tell him, hey, you got to go read this?
Yeah, I think you should have a look at this. I had also a student working on this topic, and I also encouraged him to look at this. Eventually, didn't really use it much, but I think really it's worthwhile to have a look at this correspondence, because if anything, it shows the importance of certain concepts for the authors at the time.
Right.
And what their thoughts are. And of course, in correspondence, you have a freer way of expressing yourself than in a scholarly article.
Yeah.
Right.
And also, this might be a goofy thing to say, but I know there's younger listeners watching and hearing our discussion here, Guido. But people like in the 1800s, there's lots of correspondence between famous economists, and you can find their letters. It's not like shooting the guy a text message on your iPhone, right? This was a long, so you would think through what you were going to say, you'd write the thing out. So I'm just saying that these things are a higher level of professionalism and rigor than me sending you an email.
The tone is lighter and it's more accessible, right. I think. I mean, there are examples to the contrary. I mean, Maklub and Mises were quite close. So the way they would interact in correspondence was freer and was more relaxed. I mean, there were other people with whom he was having a correspondence that's much more formal. Right, I'll give you a few examples later on. I mean, a famous literary example in economics is the correspondence between Karl Menger and Leonard Ras. Right? So the two knew very well that they were really not working from the same perspective and coming to the same conclusions, although similarly there was some superficially or some similarities, right? So the way they articulate is much more precise. Right? So they really gave a lot of thought to how they would articulate their thoughts in their correspondence. So that's not what we have here. There was a similarly friendly correspondence with Lionel Robbins, who was an Austrian in the 1920s and then up to the mid-1930s. He published this famous book on the nature and significance of economic science, and there was the second edition in 1935. And the specialists know that this second edition is a bit watered down as compared to the Austrianness is a bit watered down as compared to the first edition of 1932. So there is a correspondence with Mises and Robbins on that book. So there again, I think for anybody who would like to write a paper on this, it's an interesting Mises daily article, I think, just to write something on this, right?
Even in perhaps analogous fashion, I know Lionel Robbins, like when I wrote my pop book on the Great Depression, I relied, as one of my main sources on Lionel Robbins' book from the early 30s. And then I had critics telling me, oh, well, Robbins repudiated all that later. You know what I mean? So it's almost like there's a certain age of Lionel Robbins when I love him, and then later on I'm like, So.
Yeah. So this is interesting, right? So this is Lionel Robbins on his way out of the Austrian movement. It's not yet fully out of it, but it's on his way out. And then he really becomes very disgusted, as we know, in the later 1930s, especially because of the behavior of the Austrians who had remained in Austria, right? Meyer in particular. So he was thoroughly disgusted. But there was a general disenchantment with Austrian economics, the exact reasons of which have still not been fully elucidated. So, I mean, it will not become quite clear from that correspondence. So you have to look at all the other Robbins correspondence as well in order to get there. Yeah. Okay, what else could I mention? For example, what I found interesting, so there's this guy, Fritz Georg Steiner, Steiner, who was Austrian businessman with whom Mises had a decade-long correspondence. The guy is completely unknown. But I always thought that, I didn't have the time when I was writing the Mises biography to really look into this more detail. I mean, this is an interesting biographical question itself, right? Gives some background on the man. He was clearly in his outlook in this very pragmatic, practical businessman perspective on the world, very similar to Mises, who was also, let's not forget, this a great pragmatist. We know him as the premier Austrian theorist, but Mises comes from this Chamber of Commerce background. So he is always also rooted in the figures and the numbers. He knows everything about the state of markets.
And also, apparently, if you need your visa to be extended, just Mises knows a guy.
Mises is the guy who does it, right? So with Steiner, he has this correspondence on immigration restrictions, the cause of World War II, on Judaism. He's always a Jewish businessman, and various other issues, right? So this I found this interesting. There was a correspondence with a fellow Austrian, Leo Kappel, on Marx and literature relating to Marx. Which shows that again, Mises had these wide-ranging research and intellectual interests. There was correspondence with his Mexican friend, Montes de Oca, Montes, next word D, next word OCA, Montes de Oca. So he was a businessman from Mexico, and who had tried in the early 1940s to get Mises to come to Mexico. So he wanted to establish some Mises Institute in Mexico, and so they were corresponding a lot. Mises had gone there in 1942 to give a series of lectures and so on, and eventually decided to stay in the US. So better have a second-rate existence in the US, but still close and really in the intellectual center of the Western world at the time. Then in Mexico under very comfortable material conditions, but outside of the world of ideas, right? So without these contacts that he would have enjoyed in New York. So, but in any case, so the correspondence between the two is interesting. For example, there is this letter to Montes de Oca in January 1947 on Gottfried von Haberler and Haberler's pro-inflationism. And so this is it's a remarkable statement, because Mises in his published work would not comment on Haberler. Haberler was a good friend, and he was his wedding witness. So they were really close, and so, but in writing, he would not comment on Haberler's errors, but there with somebody who was friendly and so on, he would be more outspoken and comment on these things. What else? I mean, there are really many things, many interesting sorts of correspondence in the archives. Lionel Robbins did the correspondence is interesting. At some point in November, December 47, they were discussing what Robbins believed to be a new argument for foreign exchange controls. Right, so Robbins, just as Haberler was going pro-inflationism, Robbins was moving away from free trade and with allegedly new arguments and so on. So the two sorted this out. Is also interesting, right? You can set a student on this, just have the look at this correspondence and just to say, so what's then first of all, you can narrate this, just what did they exchange, what were the relative positions, and then you can compare this. I mean, within time, what was the state of knowledge at the time how does this compare to what we today think about free trade and protectionism and so on. Again, another author that I found very interesting was Rougier. Louis Rougier was a French philosopher, a very close friend of Mises. So this is not a Chamber of Commerce acquaintance, but I don't know actually how they got in touch. They might have come in touch through the Lippmann colloquium in 1938, I think it was in Paris, right? So it's one of the founding events of the neoliberal movement that prepares the Mont Pelerin Society and other institutions and other networks after World War II. I think Louis Rougier was participating in Mises as well. And so there are quite extensive correspondence also after the war. So, for example, I found one letter very interesting in early May 1950, in which Mises was elaborating on the proper method of fighting communists. So it was an important problem at the time. And it was also going beyond what we would find in...
do you mean like the proper arrangement of your tanks, or do you mean like...
No, I think it was Mises precisely was the intellectual combat, right? And then so in later correspondence, also with Rougier would comment on communism and American politics, right? So and they also had a correspondence on epistemological questions and so on. So it's a very rich correspondence with Rougier.
Is it fresh in your mind, or maybe you knew independently? What were his thoughts? Like, there's different strategies. Like, oh, should you mock them? Should you concede that they mean well and they're just mistaken, or should you tell people they're just driven by envy? Like, there's different. Do you know what his general views were?
No, Bob. I just made a note for myself in case I return back to this.
Okay.
And I might return back to this. I told our friends at Grove City College, look, I mean, if you really want to promote this archive, well, maybe you should have a couple of conferences around the contents, because there's so much interesting stuff in it.
Right.
And so I would be glad to help out there. And so I already have a couple of leads where we're doing this. But as far as the concrete points are concerned, I would have to look it up.
Gotcha. Okay. I mean, I know in his formal writing, Mises was always very like, let's concede that they mean, like what nowadays we would call steel manning the argument. Like, the best possible case that could be made for my opponent, and then let me knock it down. Like, I know Mises, that's kind of how he proceeded in, Human Action and his other books.
Yes. And Mises was always not only willing, but very ready to concede a good point in his opponents, right? So he was always eager to draw the best case out of this and adopt it himself, not just say, okay, yeah, this is a point, but I don't agree because it comes from you. If it's a valid point, he would adopt it. And then make it clear where precisely the error is, or if there's an error, make it clear what his reasons for disagreement were. Right, so it's really very thorough intellectual work.
Can I just ask you? This is sort of it is a tangent, not sort of a tangent, but just you're mentioning how he's interacting with all these different thinkers. The more that I learned about, the world and human inquiry in different scholarly fields, and then I would periodically reread Human Action, and it would just astound me how much Mises knew. Like, he'd have little footnotes about quantum mechanics, or about, this should not be misunderstood as conflated with the Weber-Fechner physiological law, and and so I'm just wondering, how much of that is just, Mises was this giant among even intellectuals, or is it that, old Vienna, there weren't 10,000 PhDs per street corner like there are today, and back then the people who went into learning and higher education, they kind of had to know a little bit about everything because there weren't that many of them?
I think it's both.
Okay.
I mean, clearly, it was expected at the time. You're a university professor. You need to have at least a rough knowledge of what's going on in the other disciplines. Certainly, the disciplines that are surround your own field. I mean, for example, today you're already passed as a very cultivated economist. If you're working in labor economics, that's your specialization. but you also know the basics of monetary economics and the basics of inflation or something like this. But at the time, this would have been laughable. Of course, it was expected that all professors of economics know the full field. I mean, it was not expected that they'd make contributions of their own to each of these things, but they must be fully aware of what's going on, of course, within their general field, economics, all parts of economics. But moreover, it was expected that they know what's going on in history, in politics, international relations. Everything is somehow adjacent to this, right? They must know the institutions, they must know the basics of law, commercial law, and so on. They must know history, not only economic history, but general history. I mean, this was expected of a cultivated person. Cannot be, I mean, already if you're just a university, let's say a doctor, it was expected that you be a cultivated person. You couldn't get a PhD in Vienna in 1920, Bob, if you were not a cultivated person. If you were just, as we said, well, you're a field-specific idiot. You know everything in that field, but are completely ignorant about things around it. They would not give you the PhD. It's as simple as that. You don't do it. And then if you're a professor, you are expected to have this broad knowledge, and then also ideally, well, to know a bit what's going on in physics, what's going on in chemistry, and so on, have basic notions and so on that you can participate and follow a layman's discussion on this. Right now, what's exceptional in Mises is the penetrating insight into the philosophical essence of these doctrines. Right, so it's not just that he's talking about relativity theory and so on. He sees what's the whole point of this, and on which epistemological premises is it built. So there are comments. I mean, relativity theory now, I'm not quite sure, but he certainly comments on Euclidean, non-Euclidean geometrics. Right? So he comments on this and the ultimate foundation of economic science. So I mean, this is really one of the most astonishing books that you will ever read from an economist. I mean, the kind of comments that you get there on various philosophical questions, but which were primarily discussed in a separate field in mathematics, in physics and so on. But he sees what's important in that discussion and has a more general bearing, also concerning economics. Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, he has strong opinions on probability theory. You know,
yes.
it's not just that he can, bluff and say, "Oh, yes, I'm familiar with the," you know what I mean? Well, anyway, it's it's as I said in my remarks at the supporters summit, fall of 2024, that when I was talking about Mises and contrasting him with like some big guns like Paul Krugman or other Eugene Fama and people like that in these other areas, like big famous economists and even Milton Friedman, that a lot of these other guys, they're smart, but I think they're fools, meaning that they lack wisdom. And that was the thing for me, that Mises, I do think he's smart and intelligent, but to me is he seems incredibly wise when you read him, that he understands how much importance to put on a particular factor, and not, I can draw up this model where this happens, and so therefore let's have the government take over the export sector.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's really it. And of course, this is the upshot also of traditional philosophy, right? The knowledge in any specific field is not an objective in itself, right? But ultimately is geared to what action. And Mises explains this very clearly in his biographical recollections, that he says, I mean, what piqued his interest in economics, what brought him to economics, is that we had here a discipline that was preeminently suited to answer practical questions, right? But of course, just knowing economics is not enough. But you need to know the context. You need to have the proper weighing of the different factors that come into play. It's not just one theorem that will ask you questions and things that are relevant in whatever, steering a family or steering a business or steering the government of a country, national government or something like this. Right.
Okay, well, I kind of hijacked that discussion for a second. Is there anything else that you wanted to hit as we're starting to wrap up here?
Okay, wait, let me see. Okay, so lots of correspondence. Let me see. Just walk through some of the authors that might be interesting. He had this correspondence with various religious people. Okay, so this is interesting. Niemeyer, he was a Presbyterian. Or Niemeyer, I don't know exactly how you pronounce his family name. Kirchner. He had a correspondence with Helmut Schöck on envy, on the study of envy, before Schöck published his book. The famous book on envy was published in 1970. So this is correspondence from 1954, right? You find it in the Schöck files in the Mises archive. There is a German fellow. He was a publisher in Germany, Volkmar Muthesius, Muthesius, and with him, he had a correspondence, especially on the order liberal school, right? So the German neoliberals, which is interesting. Should be especially interesting for people interested in neoliberalism, the order libertarianism, and so on. There is correspondence with Ayn Rand. Okay, so there's a Rand file for our fans, so they definitely should have a look at the Rand file. There is correspondence with Bruno Leoni. Okay, there's correspondence with Bertrand de Jouvenel, a famous French political scientist. There is correspondence with Hayek, of course. Opitz, another religious leader, with William Hutt, the South African economist. So Hutt is, of course, a famously difficult author. Right. So for the few students who have ever gone through a book by Hutt, so he has an uneasy pen. But in the correspondence, actually more easy. So it's one of the things that it makes it more accessible. And I would say, there's much more, but I try to highlight just one last thing. There are a few papers and research documents or memoranda that he wrote. For example, there is a research proposal that he addressed to the National Bureau of Economic Research, of which he was a fellow in the early 1940s when he arrived in the US. He wrote a research proposal for a collective 2-volume work on the history of European decay in the 19th century. Okay, how is that? So I think that's still worth a look. I mean, how did Mises think that this should be handled? This could still inspire one or another person. He gave, there's also a report in the NBR file on his research activities by 1941. So it's a concise presentation of what he had done up to that point. Also interesting.
So like at that time, the Elon Musk asked him, give me 5 bullet points of what you've been working on?
Exactly. And you have until next Monday. But it was easier for him because he had to relate 5 bullet points for the previous life. So it's probably easier, right?
Right. And he had been working, so there's that too.
And he had been working. I think he would have found no difficulty summarizing in 5 bullet points what he had done the previous week. He also, with Montes de Oca, whom we have already mentioned, he had he wrote up regulations for the International Institute of the Social Sciences. So it's the Mises Institute that Montes de Oca promised to set up in Mexico for him. So it's also interesting. How did Mises envision should be the proper regulations of such an institution? Now it's too late to set this up for the Mises Institute because the Mises Institute already exists, but maybe something similar in the future will come up. There is a program and reading list for the 1949 seminar at New York University. Also interesting. And there are there's correspondence with J. Howard Pugh, whom you know. So he was an oil magnate. The Pugh family, they owned Sun Oil. I mean, I think today a few young Americans realized that the birthplace of the American oil industry was not Texas, but Pennsylvania. And so not far away from the oil fields in Pennsylvania, is Grove City College. So it's not an accident that Grove City College was established there with money coming from an oil magnate family, J. Howard Pugh. And it was also the gentleman who brought Hans Sennholz in 1956 to Grove City College.
Oh, okay.
So that's the connection. So this correspondence with J. Howard Pugh is interesting. There was a very strong mutual trust, and I had just made a note for myself that Mises had commented in one of the in a 1957 letter on Melchior Pally's manuscript, Menace Currency as Khosrow. So this is not the Pally of the Great Transformation. This is the brother, the libertarian brother. Who is the good? Is the good Pally.
Okay, well, this is great stuff. Just two things that I had noticed when I was going through that might interest people, just besides like the correspondence and whatnot, is there are newspaper clippings, some of them, showing a headshot of Mises, like, oh, economists get, appointed to some commission or whatever it is. And so the reason I like that is I think sometimes we have this as fans of Mises and, feeling like, oh, the system is against us, that we might underplay like how big of a deal he was, in his day, that he wasn't some obscure figure, that, he was, his headshot would make it into the newspapers and things.
Yes.
And then another, like, in terms of the type of thing that's in the archives, there was Mises, the review he wrote for Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State, I think was for the New Individualist Review. And you like the typewritten manuscript, that's scanned and in there. So again, it's not like new, you could have gone and read that anyway, but it's neat to see like the thing that Mises actually typed up, that's scanned in there. So it's the things like that.
Yeah. Mises wouldn't type, it was always Margaret. When it was typed,
okay, well, there you go. Yeah. And that wouldn't have gone into GDP because he didn't pay her. So
exactly. But she wouldn't know.
Okay, so thank you, Guido. I appreciate your time, folks. My guest has been Guido Hülsmann, Senior Fellow at the Mises Institute. So, Guido, thanks so much for taking your time to explain this to us and everything you've been doing.
My pleasure, Bob, and thank you for relegating the good news to a larger public. So these archives are worth a visit, and they're definitely a treat for everybody who loves Mises and for people who are just looking for some food for thought and material for at least some nice articles. We're all looking forward to more stuff coming out of this.
Okay, thank you. And of course, folks, we'll put links, in the show notes page here so you can find it easily. Thank you for your interest, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.